For the uninitiated, the Overton window is an approach to identifying which ideas define the domain of acceptability within a democracy's possible governmental policies. Proponents of policies outside the window seek to persuade or educate the public in order to move or expand the window, while proponents of current policies or similar ones within the window will often seek to convince people that policies outside of it should be deemed unacceptable. Or to put it more plainly, those who hold the power generally get to say how big the picture should be and say what is or isn't missing. This is a crucial concept to be aware of when it comes to approaching problems experienced by boys and men, because it helps to highlight three of the biggest parameters placed around the subject of addressing gendered inequalities impacting on boys and men. The first concerns acknowledgement that such a thing exists. Because until relatively recently, the concept of gender equality, or more specifically gendered inequality, was a conversation which revolved almost entirely around the perceived rights and disadvantages experienced by women. As a consequence, rights and disadvantages experienced specifically or predominantly by men frequently fall outside of the scope or Overton window that determines what we even mean by the term gender equality. For example, the United Nations define gender equality as meaning that women and men and girls and boys should enjoy the same rights, resources, opportunities and protections. And yet, in reality, gender equality projects and programs funded by the United Nations almost exclusively focus on promoting opportunities and protections for women and girls. Something multimillionaire Hollywood movie star Emma Watson helped to highlight in 2014 when she entirely unironically called on men to become more proactive in championing the rights of people like her. Nevertheless, such institutional-driven initiatives and commitments to the concept of equality for all do ultimately make it harder for some gendered inequalities to be ignored. Policymakers across the Western world have now become increasingly concerned about the prospect of a growing underclass of undereducated men, with teenage boys now 50% more likely than girls to fail to achieve basic proficiency in maths, reading and science in OECD countries. Suicide is also now 3 to 4 times more common among men in all prosperous OECD countries, and women often outnumber men by more than 2 to 1 in older age. Once the basic concept of male inequalities has been accepted within the Overton window, 2 additional parameters exist which significantly impact on our ability to address them. One relates to agreeing upon the most effective way of addressing problems, and the other involves establishing what problems actually exist. By way of example, is cutting the genitals of infant children perceived to be a problem? And if so, what should be done?
Circumcision is a feminist issue. It isn't only about children's rights, it's about the rights of the mother who's just given birth. Women having their brand new baby, 8 days old, whatever, taken into another room to have part of his body cut off, are profoundly disempowered. When they are made to choose between their maternal instincts, which are all clamouring to say, I want to protect my baby, I want to hold him and love him, keep him close, not let any harm come to him. And on the other hand, the voice of the tribe, which is bigger than the individual, saying, nope, this is a sacred ancient ritual. You have to hand the boy over to the men to be circumcised.
All 3 aforementioned parameters highlight the significant level of control and influence that has been achieved by the large, well-resourced and effective political lobby base, pushing a predominantly pro-feminist perspective on men, masculinities, and gender equality. The book Everyday Sexism by writer and campaigner Laura Bates provides a useful example of such a perspective, and it also very effectively highlights the limitations of this approach, particularly within the context of the relevant public policy making infrastructure established by instruments such as the Equality Act 2010. Bates's book examines experiences and perspectives of prejudice, stereotyping, direct or indirect discrimination on the basis of sex across 12 chapters divided into themes such as politics, the media, objectification, silencing, harassment, violence, work, parenthood, and personal characteristics such as sexual orientation, race, age, and disability. Her central presumption that women are the disproportionate casualties of sexism allows her to objectively justify presenting an analysis and perspective of prejudice, stereotyping, and direct or indirect discrimination that exclusively focuses on women and girls. The one exception to this is the shortest chapter in the book, where she addresses her comprehension of everyday sexism impacting on men. In this chapter, a range of problems experienced by men are acknowledged, and to some extent they exist across the spectrum of themes explored in previous chapters. However, her pro-feminist perspective can be seen to be limiting in two very significant ways. Firstly, the examples examined, such as mockery of male nurses or men who take paternity leave, tend to sit comfortably within the framework of her own perception of a patriarchal social structure, punishing deviation from predominant concepts of masculinity. And secondly, any acknowledgement of disadvantage or challenges experienced by men are presented within the fixed presumption that individually and collectively, gender bias is an issue that predominantly affects women both in terms of frequency and the level of impact on their life. As she succinctly summarises, sexism against men is not good, and it's not non-existent, but it's not the same thing. From her perspective, sexism, and by extension inequality experienced by boys or men, is somehow secondary and sits apart from the perceived impact of the systematic and structural oppression that informs the rest of the book. And this logic leads her to reframe male inequalities as issues concerning men's welfare and well-being that largely sit outside of the legal and civil rights framework, crucial to traditional concepts and approaches to addressing gender equality. As a consequence, she fails to even once acknowledge the widely reported underachievement of boys at every single stage of UK education. And significantly, she also spends the bulk of her chapter about men criticising men's rights activists and the fact that they reject the feminist orthodoxy that informs her own worldview. Bates's supreme belief in the supremacy of her own political philosophy ultimately leads her to severely underestimate the level of dominance it currently has, particularly within the sphere of public policy making. By way of example, in April 2018, when the Council of Europe's predominantly male Committee of Ministers agreed a 5-year action plan for achieving the effective realisation of gender equality in all European member states, they noted that it is essential that all parties engaged in the preparation and delivery of gender equality strategies ensure that the needs of both men and boys, and women and girls, are adequately addressed. This was said in the context of acknowledging the significant inequality of outcome trends impacting on boys and men throughout Europe in relation to health and education. And yet the plan the Council adopted almost exclusively focuses on promoting opportunities and protections for women and girls, as does the European Commission's similar parallel strategy. And any acknowledgement of inequalities impacting on boys and men and the possible reasons for them are considered exclusively through the political prism of their potential impact on women and girls. For example, the most explicit recognition of any issues impacting on boys and men addressed by either strategy can be found in the Council of Europe's Strategic Objective 1, which is to prevent and combat gender stereotypes and sexism. It states the following: gender stereotype and patriarchy negatively affect men and boys too. Stereotypes about men and boys also result from and are the cause of deeply ingrained attitudes, values, norms, and prejudices. Hegemonic masculinities are a contributing factor to maintaining and reinforcing gender stereotypes, which in turn contribute to sexist hate speech and prejudice against men and boys who deviate from the predominant concepts of masculinity. This includes perceptions about what both women and men should look like, how they should behave, what careers they should pursue, and what household tasks they should take on. Structural inequalities and persisting gender stereotypes affecting women and men, girls and boys, continue to be present in the education and childcare system and extend all the way to the labour market. This is to a large extent due to the effects of the disproportionate weight of household and care responsibilities on women, gender biases and stereotypes about education and career choices, affecting both women and men. Occupational choices of women, often an extension of their traditional role as caretakers, can be influenced through incentives and positive policy and legislative measures, such as parental leave, thus creating opportunities for men to become role models for other men regarding traditional female occupations. Inevitably, all of the related actions and strategies aimed at eradicating prejudice and gender stereotypes throughout Europe are informed by this perspective. Another key strategic priority is the legal accession of all member states to principles enshrined in the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, commonly referred to as the Istanbul Convention. The noble purpose of the convention is to create enhanced protections and safeguards aimed at tackling the violation of basic human rights experienced by women and girls who suffer violence, including domestic violence. However, the scope of protection afforded by the convention does not extend to male victims of violence, who as a consequence are essentially afforded second-class status within countries who adopt the principles. Because from a feminist perspective, it's not the same thing. In practice, one outcome of the legal enhancement of rights for women and girls can be that boys and men are effectively lifted out of the framework for protecting universal human rights. At a UK level, Parliament is currently 2/3 male, and the Conservative government is even more predominantly male. And yet, incredibly, boys and men are specifically excluded from the remit of their Equalities Office. As a consequence, the government's recently announced roadmap for achieving gender equality at every stage of life effectively ignores 49% of the UK population. And so inevitably, while it includes a commitment to invest in educational programmes to increase female participation in STEM subjects, like Bates before it completely ignores the highly significant gendered inequalities relating to underattainment at every level of education, specifically because they impact on boys. Because from a feminist perspective, it's not the same thing.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.